Hello everybody, my name is Zach with Overrated Gamers. Welcome to a Pauper deck tech. This one is on mono blue control. Short little disclaimer before I start this. This is not a deck I created myself. I did get it off of MTG Goldfish, probably about 6 months to a year ago. I've been playing for it for quite a while. It's actually, in my opinion, one of the best Pauper decks, if not the best Pauper deck. It caps out technically at about 2 mana. Well, technically, a lot of the cards have alternate costs you can pay, like Gush, or Ninja the D-Powers, or Spire Golem with its affinity for islands. Now, the deck only runs 17 lands, and it's one of the few decks in Pauper where you're okay with keeping a 1-land hand. Generally, if you do keep a 1-land hand, you want at least a Ponder or a Preordain in it. I'm going to go over the cards one by one. Yes, there are multiple copies. I just have them set like this because it's easier. So first up, we have our Delver of Secrets. Generally, you can play him turn 1. We don't really have any counter magic for turn 1 other than Daze. On turn 2 and later, you want to leave mana open unless you almost pretty much know that your opponent can't do anything about what you're playing at the time. We're not technically an aggro deck, even though it can play like one. So we have Delver of Secrets. He's a 1-mana 1/1. Beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. You may reveal it. If it's an instant or sorcery card, transform him. To transform him, you pull him out, flip him over, and you have a 3/2 flyer for just 1 mana. He's actually one of the last cards you want to play behind Bone Splitter though on turn 1. Normally you're going to want to play Ponder or Preordain on turn 1 if you only have 1 land in hand, or Fairy Miscreant if you have that, so you can set up for Spellstutter Sprite or another Fairy Miscreant drawing you another card. Getting more cards is how this deck stays ahead, and it's how you're able to do so many 1-for-1s against your opponent when it comes to your regular counter spells, or 2-for-1 if you get out the Spellstutter Sprite. We have Preordain, which I just went over. It's 1 blue sorcery. Scry 2, draw a card. We have Ponder, which I also went over. You look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them back in any order. You may shuffle your library, draw a card. Fairy Miscreant. This card replaced a previous fairy that was in the deck, that when it came into play untapped 2 lands, you could discard it to draw a card. So it paid for itself, it drew you a card. It actually wasn't banned because of this deck though, it was banned because of an infinite combo in a completely different deck. Fairy Miscreant though is a 1 blue 1/1 flying, and when it comes into play, if you control another creature named Fairy Miscreant, it draws you a card. So it does replace itself if there are other ones out, but more importantly, it allows your Spellstutter Sprite to counter things with higher converted mana costs. After that, we have Bone Splitter. Mine's in, I think, Chinese? Possibly Japanese. I can't quite tell, to be honest. But it's a 1-drop equipment, and the equipped creature gets +2/+0, and it costs 1 to equip. It just makes all your creatures into fairly large threats. In Pauper, a 3/1 isn't a half-bad creature. Well, sort of, but basically you put it on your Fairy Miscreant, you have a 3/1 that you can swing with, and if they block, chances are what they're blocking with is probably dying, and you are okay with that. So yeah, or you can put it on Spire Golem or any of those other guys. Spellstutter Sprite, 1 in a blue, the all-star of this deck. It has Flash, Flying, 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, counter target spell with converted mana cost X or less, where X is the number of fairies you control. Now, we're only running a total of 8 fairies. 8 fairies is more than enough for this card, especially because Pauper being a lot of commons and just the nature of the format itself. Not much really goes above 4. I mean, there are decks that do. That's what you want to save your counter spell for. We have other counters in the deck. Use these to counter the lower costs, and the other counters to hit things like if they're an Eldrazi deck. If they're the Tron deck, then you want to hit some of their high cost cards. As I just said, straight up counterspell. Blue, blue, counter a spell. Not much to say here other than make sure you're saving this for their higher costed threats, because you want to, you daze early on, you play the Spell Stutter Sprite to hit some of their lower costs. We have Snap. It's 1 and a blue, return target creature to its owner's hand, untap up to 2 lands. Now, this has a lot of utility in the deck, because you can shoot your opponent's creature to their hand if you don't have a counterspell, or if they put a bunch of enchantments on it and it's not Boggles, because they all have hexproof and you can't target them with Snap. Or you can use this to return one of your fairies to your hand, specifically the counter fairy, and then counter one of their spells. You just sit there with 2 mana open, bounce it back, it'll untap 2 lands, you play it again, protects your ninjas, so just all around pretty strong card for the deck. If it didn't untap the lands, this card would actually probably be unrunnable. Deprive, 2 blue. It is counterspell, but as an additional cost you have to return a land to your hand. It's worth noting that when it says additional cost, that does mean, as you're casting it, so even if they counter it, you have to return that land to your hand. It's going to be a little dangerous if you're playing another control deck and you're on turn 2 playing this, because we curve out around turn 2 or 3. That's when we start getting control over the board. Around turn 4 is where you completely stabilize. Daze, 1 and a blue instant, but you can return an island to your hand rather than pay Daze's mana cost. It counters a spell unless its controller pays 1. So this card is fantastic on the early turns. Later on your opponent's probably not tapping out. We do only run 2 of these, in part because late game it's pretty bad. But it allows you to have a turn 1 counterspell. Yes, it does set you back a land though, so you do want to think pretty carefully about, well, is that lightning bolt, if they're burned for example, you probably just want to take that lightning bolt on turn 1 if that's what they're playing. If they're playing something like a Delver, then yeah, it's worth getting behind on land drops to counter something like that. Ninja of the Deep Hours, 3 and a blue for a 2/2, but he has an ability called Ninjutsu. You pay 1 and a blue to return an untapped attacker you control to your hand, put him into play from your hand tapped and attacking. So he just swaps place with another attacking creature, as long as it was unblocked. Whenever Ninja of the Deep Hours deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. Generally, the turn he's coming out, he's probably drawing you a card unless they kill it. And then the following turns you can continue to swing with that one, and then swing some of your flyers. He doesn't have flying, so chances are later on he might die, but he still nets you at least 1 free card. And if he does happen to eat a kill spell, well, that's perfectly fine actually. We have Gush, 4 and a blue instant. It's worth noting this card is actually banned in Legacy, but it is legal in Pauper, which I find kind of entertaining. You can return 2 islands you control to their owner's hand instead of paying its mana cost. Draw 2 cards. Now there was actually a guy who wrote an entire book about when to play this card. Generally, I don't play it before turn 4. Now, I'll happily play it after I'm tapped out. Playing it before turn 4 runs you the risk of getting too far behind your opponent to be able to, successfully answer their threats. Playing it on turn 2, you lose all of your lands. There might be, instances where you need to do that, but you want to do that very sparingly before. As I said, don't usually do this before turn 4. And finally we have Spire Golem, 6 mana 2/4 flying with an affinity for islands, costs 1 less for each island you control. Usually I try to wait till about turn 4 to play him, so he's only 2 mana for 2/4, leaves me 2 mana open to counter things, respond to what my opponent's doing. You always want to have mana up in this deck, even if you don't have anything to play. Something else worth noting is there's a decent amount of cards that return islands to your hand. If your opponent's not keeping track of that, you can bluff some of those as counterspells. Now the deck does do pretty well in most matchups. As long as burn doesn't hit you too fast and hard, you can generally stabilize and just start countering everything they're playing. Boggles can be a problem if they get a turn 1 boggle out. Generally at some point they do start sticking just because you can't counter absolutely everything your opponent does. That's just the nature of the deck. Not everything in here is a counterspell. So once the boggles start sticking, then things start putting those auras on them. Once again, countering the auras. Most of their deck is auras. They only run about 12, I think, creatures into Dryad Arbor. So it can be a bit of a problem. They also have hexproof, so you can't really bounce them to hand. That's the only real deck I've had a problem with. Eldrazi Tron is fine. I haven't played too many other control decks. I mean, in the mirror match, you want to start sideboarding in, you know, like your Hydroblast, your Dispels. But it's a fairly strong deck. It's a good deck if you want to get into Pauper. All Pauper decks are pretty cheap for the most part, so it doesn't really matter which one you choose. But you can also, if you know the matchup, you can tap out if you know that whatever they're going to do isn't enough of a problem to completely stop you. You can also tap out if you have an idea of what they're going to play and you want to daze whatever they're playing. But as I've said, get used to playing the deck before you do stuff like that. Get used to the format if you're new to it. But yeah, that's it for Pauper Delver. I'll post a link, as I said, in the description below. Thank you everybody for watching. Let me know if you like this. If so, I do have one or two other Pauper decks I can put up on here. I haven't really made any of my own completely. I am looking to change the sideboard for this deck. The main board is basically perfect. As I've said, I don't think I can improve the main board. I can improve the sideboard. But yeah, at some point I may make my own Pauper deck. I've been doing a little bit of research and I may have an idea for something. I'm not going to name it yet because I haven't fully finished it or fleshed it out. Thank you everybody for watching. We'll see you in our next video.